With glad hearts, we acknowledge and affirm the trans and gender diverse friends in our Quaker communities and express appreciation for the contribution and gifts that they bring to our meetings, which are communities made up of people with a diverse range of gender expressions. The end of our travelling is for differences, not to divide us. We rejoice in recognising God's creation in one another. That is what love requires of us. So that comes from Britain Yearly Meeting, the epistle, back in 2021, and was effectively the first major expression from Quakers as a whole of their affirmation of the trans community. Not to say that the trans community weren't welcome beforehand, but this was where it was sort of officially, as much as a Quakers can ever officially say, officially recognised. And this is what I want to talk about today, Quakerism and the trans community. What's been the link? What's the connection? And why is it so important? A couple of things we might need to mention first. I am not trans myself, so I recognise I'm talking about another group. I haven't gone through what they've gone through. And so if I get things wrong, I'm really sorry, and please do let me know. But what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to uphold and support, just like the epistle said, our trans friends, and try and show why Quakerism is a welcoming place for trans people. So we're going to be looking at maybe the spiritual side of things. We're going to be looking at the historical context and perhaps some faithful action and what we can be doing as a community, as local meetings to best support these friends. So why is Quakerism welcoming of the trans community then? I think there are at least 4 reasons I can think of. There probably are more. The first of is that we believe in that of God in everyone. And that means that God speaks to everyone. And what that therefore means is when God is speaking to someone, we need to believe what they are saying. It's a fundamental concept of Quakerism that if someone is giving ministry, we need to believe that to be a message from the divine. And so if we start questioning when people say something integral and truthful, and we start saying, oh, that's all lies, is that really true? Are you sure? If we start with that aspect, our whole concept of worship and ministry loses its foundation, I feel. So all people, including trans, non-binary, and gender diverse friends, all reflect the divine. On equality, kind of similar there, is one of our major testimonies and has been really important to friends throughout our history. And so we cannot erase difference. And in fact, actually, we should honour diversity and uphold it. Now, I know that this is also, in many people's minds, a relatively new concept. But trans people, trans friends have always existed. I'll talk some more about that in a bit. But we do believe in the idea of continuing revelation and new light. We have no fixed creed. Our thoughts and of the world around us and how we act in the world changes over time. We believe quite strongly that faith is through listening and is lived out through change and openness to transformation, not just us as the listeners, but also open to transformation physically as well. Another thing is that I think that Quakers have a long history of standing up for the marginalised. I mentioned that in my video with Peterson Toscano. The marginalised often changes in our society as society shifts, but there are always people that society marginalises. And I think it's the Christian, but also the Quaker duty to uphold and support these people who, because of social structures, have been ostracised by the community at large. And I think Quakers do have a long history of doing this. And I think it's something that we should continue to do. Far from being like a new thing that Quakers are starting to do, I think this represents a long history of upholding those people. Now, trans people, I feel, are feeling particularly marginalised right now in our society. And so therefore, we need to up our game in order to fight back against that non-violently and peacefully, but to say you are welcome. And I think this really does matter in the UK, but also across the world. Trans people are experiencing hostility in the media, in public discourse, government policy, online abuse, all that sort of thing. And this leads, obviously, to real consequences, mental health issues, hate crimes, and barriers that affect them on a very personal level. And Quakers have been people of action, and I think we've been guilty of it before, where we stay silent on a matter, but that does naturally also involve a certain amount of complicity if we stay silent. So I think it's really good that Quakers, as of 2021, made this very, very, very blatant testimony of peace and truth. Call us to resist these fear-based narratives and stand in solidarity. It's made harder by the fact that we are a community of diverse beliefs, and not all friends are always in the same place in understanding gender identity. But I think Quakers are really good at sitting with this unknowing, this doubt, this unsure feeling. It's what we do in meetings all the time. People might give ministry that might be really challenging to us. We might not like it at the time, but we might see how that actually is still the truth, and we might have to just change our beliefs in order to fit in this new revelation. And I think we have to be hopeful as well with these friends who are still kind of working things out, because we do believe that the divine is always talking, and so we'd like to think that these discussions are going in the right direction. And one thing I just wanted to say about these epistles as well, and what they are, these aren't. Before I went to yearly meeting, yes, I went to yearly meeting, I kind of had the impression that these were maybe a bit more administrative than they actually are. I thought, oh, these are just statements that the organisers put out as a sort of summary of what was said. But that isn't actually what happens. The way these epistles are formed is that everyone hears them, everyone talks about what they feel led to say, what they would like to change, how they would phrase things, and that is threshed out in the meeting. And so it's not a administrative, oh, just type up what was said. It's certainly spirit led. And so this is what Quakers have come to when meeting en masse spiritually. So I just really want to say why this actually is more important than just a statement, maybe to the media. So looking at our history then, and how Quakers have always looked to uphold gender diversity. I mean, we could just look, for example, at the role of women in early Quakerism. That was highly controversial and highly unsettling for a lot of people in 17th century England, that women were preaching. But not only were they preaching, they were leaders. If you look at the Valiant 60, there are a lot of women in there. There are some that are more famous than others. One could argue that some of the women should be more well known than they are, even in Quaker circles, but they're still there. Another powerful example of this is the story of Jemima Wilkinson, who, after a near-death experience in 1776, claimed to have been reborn as a genderless spirit, and they took the name the Public Universal Friend. And the Friend, as they referred to themselves, declared that the soul of Jemima had departed, and this new being had been sent by God to preach repentance and righteousness. So from that moment on, they rejected the use of gendered pronouns. They avoided their birth name, and they dressed in, I'll try and put some photos, they dressed in ambiguous robes that defied, obviously, the gender expectations of the time. So the Public Universal Friend was in America and New England in particular, and gathered a community around them and lived a life of celibacy, spiritual authority, and public witness. So they were assigned female at birth, but refused ultimately to be defined by that identity or any binary at all. So this was the late 1700s. This isn't happening in 2020. And yet this person stood in bold defiance to both social norms and the gender categories of the time. Now, it has to be clear, the Public Universal Friend wasn't a Quaker in the formal sense after their spiritual rebirth, but they were raised by a Quaker community, and also many of their earliest followers were Quakers. And I think their theology echoed the language of the inner light, personal revelation, and a direct relationship with the divine, which are all obviously, especially from a liberal Quaker perspective, absolutely the same as what we're talking about now. As we've seen in modern times as well, some friends were very uncomfortable with their gender ambiguity, but others were really inspired. And I'm really glad that we have this character as part of our heritage as well. I've been rereading Mark Russ's book, The Spirit of Freedom, because he's got a chapter towards the end of his book on a Quaker theology of trans-inclusion, which I think is excellent. He reminded me in this that Quakers were doing all sorts of things like this. So he was talking about particularly James Naylor, who at the end of his writings wouldn't sign off just saying James Naylor. He would say something like, whose name in the flesh is James Naylor, or written by one whom the world knows as James Naylor. This idea that our worldly self might not actually best represent our spiritual self. And actually, what trans people are doing is a physical manifestation of the spiritual transformation that we might be talking about. A good quote that I think summarizes his view on this is that he says that in faithfully expressing who they know themselves to be, trans friends enflesh the truth that a spirit-led life leads to a reorientation, renewal, or discovery of identity. I think another thing that might make Quakerism welcoming to the trans community is how we talk about the divine. We don't exclusively, some do, but we don't exclusively use the word God and the links that has with masculinity, for example. We use phrases more like the divine or light, which is obviously neither female nor male. And as I've talked about before, in other languages, in terms of grammatical gender, is different depending on different languages. Some things that need to be maybe worked on and things that we need to improve might be the idea of making sure that we're not simply doing performative allyship, that we're not just saying that we're welcoming of the trans community without actually doing anything actively for it. Do our meetings really represent a welcoming community and a sense of belonging? Really? Do our actions match, this epistle and our testament is here? We'll talk about maybe some real changes or some real actions that we can take in order to do this maybe a bit later on. We must also consider that inclusion has to be holistic. It has to be wide ranging. We're talking particularly about Quakers and the trans community today, but obviously this inclusion includes people of color, people who are neurodivergent, the disabled, people from different social classes, and obviously all of these people could be trans. So what more can we do then? How can we be more welcoming? When speaking with Paul Parker, we were talking about this idea of radical welcome, and I've been really influenced by this phrase since he mentioned it. I've really enjoyed it. Mark Russ goes as far to say, the future of Quakerism involves the full, affirming, and loving inclusion of trans and non-binary people, or it doesn't have much of a future at all. On a practical level, this could be making sure that things like toilets are all gendered, that there's inclusive signage, and pronoun sharing. I mentioned that in my video on the alternative to the Quaker handshake. When I was speaking to Peterson Toscano as well, he was saying that, we know that we're inclusive. But how do we let the trans community know, who might not know about Quakers, that we're inclusive? Because, people who may have felt marginalized or excluded from faith communities might just put us all into the same category, and so might not even consider going to a Quaker meeting because they might feel that, well, they're all the same. Why would they accept me when some of the bigger institutions don't? So I think making it very, very clear, having signs saying that they are, making it really, really very, very clear so that anyone that finds out about Quakers knows that this is a space where they'll be welcome. I think we also need to educate ourselves, definitely, myself included, because it's not my experience. I don't know much about it. I have been watching. I'll put a link to below. There's quite a lot of books that have been recommended to me. I'll put those there. I've watched quite a few of the Quake Speak videos. They've had a couple of trans friends on there to talk about their experiences, so I would recommend having a look at that. But maybe have a time to talk about it, and if there's confusion, then I think that's a time to really to kind of talk about it and do it in a Quaker way that leads to the sense of the meeting as to where we are currently and what might we need to do in order to be more welcoming. There is obviously also a political side to this as well, and the idea of political witness and social action. I know that Quakers are big on looking to support inclusive legislation and to challenge transphobia. And I think ultimately, in all of this, I've kind of been talking about maybe newcomer trans friends, but we've also got to remember that there could be very well people who are gender questioning in our meetings right now. And so how are we supporting these people who we might not know, and they might not know fully that they're going on this journey as well? So how can we create safe spaces where people feel comfortable in exploring their identity? So I think some maybe advices in a very Quaker way that we could be considering when looking to be welcoming to the trans community. We could look at things like, what does love require of us? Honestly, if you're confused or if you haven't engaged with gender diversity before, could you honestly say that love requires you to shun these people? And even still me, I say I've read a certain amount, but I don't know the whole experience. And so am I willing to be changed further? Am I willing to have maybe constructs which I haven't considered to be challenged. Because I think the cis community at large, probably, even if they're welcoming, probably don't realize when there's an inherent anti-trans rhetoric. And so people always have to be open to maybe that they have been wrong without even necessarily realizing it, but that there's still an opportunity to grow. And speaking directly to my trans friends, hello. I hope this has been reasonably representative of some of the challenges and hopefully some of the solutions that you'd like to see in our communities. If there's any questions or any suggestions, obviously please do let us know. I think there's always room to understand each other more, in any capacity. You know, it doesn't even need to be in the trans capacity. I think we can always understand each other better. We always come to understand each other better, but we can only do that if we're in community with each other, if we are actually doing the talking and not living in fear or even worrying about saying the wrong thing. We've got to have an open and trusting community in order to do that, and we can only do that if we're together. So thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.